Okay, hello everybody. So this short video lecture is to continue kind of thinking about critical thinking, which is something that Professor Herrick talked about. And I think it's important to kind of move beyond simply reporting facts about something and thinking about this sort of broader skill set called critical thinking. And we do it every day and like in our daily lives, but I want to kind of build on some of the things that we've already been talking about. Now, George Bernard Shaw, this is, I guess, generally attributed to George Bernard Shaw. This idea that 2% of people think, 3% think they think, and 95% doesn't think at all, which is rather pessimistic, right? And I came across this primarily because I was looking for like some statistics on critical thinking. But I don't think this is scientific, right? It's just, again, Bernard Shaw being critical of the way that people engage in critical thinking, right? And I think he says, think, 2% of people think. I believe what he's talking about is critical thinking. Naturally, all people think, we think on a daily basis. It's just a difference of what we think about and how we think, right? So let's look at another definition. I know Professor Herrick gave us one. So critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process. So we're intellectually disciplined, intentional, right? Process, just like maybe like the scientific method of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication. Okay, so again, that kind of goes back to this idea of looking at multiple sources, thinking about the sources, assessing reliability, bias, and all of those things in our sources. What I think is also helpful here is that we are synthesizing material, so we're bringing material together, but also that there's a range of information that we're pulling from for our critical thinking. It's things that we are observing, what do we see, what are our experiences, and then we're pulling in other resources. One thing that often comes up in a class like this is that students have a personal experience or personal connection to a topic. And what I always encourage is, let's see if our individual experience or lived experience is similar to what is in the research. And that way that it can be kind of a good starting point. So let's look at a couple of these keywords a little bit more in depth, right? So actively, we are doing it intentionally, so not passively, right? We're actively engaged in this process of critical thinking. We know that we're thinking about our thinking, and become sort of metacognitive at that point. We're applying, analyzing, and synthesizing. I already sort of talked about this, but we're doing something with the information, again, to differentiate between sort of the research we'll do in the research track versus sort of our country report or report on an animal. And again, of course, we have our information literacy part, which is that evaluating information. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it biased? Is it reliable? Is it up to date or is it out of date? And then lastly, as a guide to belief and action, right? What are our next steps? Now, again, for something like a literature review or a research project like we'll be doing in Honors200, 250, and 296, we're probably not going to solve a problem. All we're doing is advancing the discussion on a solution to a problem. So just kind of keep that in mind, that we're not necessarily, there's no pressure for us to solve a problem definitively. So if you're interested in something like global warming, climate change, if you can solve this issue, please do, but there's no pressure on you to actually solve it. It's just making that incremental step, right, to think about how we can begin to improve or change things. Okay, so I'm going to kind of move into a couple other things here in regards to practical application of critical thinking, and kind of even thinking about why critical thinking is important. And it kind of goes back to George Bernard Shaw's quote about 2% of people thinking. 3% thinking they think. So as I was looking for, again, more statistics on this, what I was interested in and sort of researching is um, how good people are at critical thinking. And this came up in Professor Herrick's guest lecture, that critical thinking can be developed, that it's not a static. We're born with one level of critical thinking and we cannot improve, right? So the question then becomes, where are we at with critical thinking as a sort of general population, and how can we begin to develop those critical thinking skills? And that's a question that I'm really interested in. So my little bit of research led me to a study that is from the University of Melbourne that summarized two other reports that I found worth calling out here. So a recent study from the OECD involving 120,000 students from 6 countries found that 1/5 of students performed at the lowest levels in critical thinking, with half performing at the lowest 2 levels. A US study noted that 45% of college students showed no significant gains in critical thinking, complex reasoning, or writing skills over their 4-year degree. Now, we could go down a rabbit hole with this information, but what's interesting is, if we go to the first one, of those 120,000 students, a fifth would be 24,000, right? So we're looking at quite a big population. Now, because I want to also sort of mimic the research process, I don't want to just take these quotes at face value. So what I did, you can see here in what I copied from the University of Melbourne, that they actually hyperlinked the other reports. So I went and found those. Actually, it wasn't that difficult because they were linked. And let me go back for a second. So one thing that stood out to me, and the question I had, maybe you had this question too, is it says, at the lowest level in critical thinking, I wanted to know, like, what were those levels? And if I were really interested into this, I would look at other data, like how did they perform the tests, who performed them, what level of critical thinking skills did people have, and training, things like that. There's a lot of other factors that I think we need to take into account before we just sort of accept this whole cloth, which I think, again, in our modern world, people see statistics like this and they don't delve into where's it coming from, who did the research, why did they do the research, how did they do the research, and all of those things. Okay, so this is the actual chart that shows the sort of levels. So you have like the advanced critical thinking skills, 2%. I find it fascinating that the advanced is in agreement with George Bernard Shaw, if that's who actually said that quote. 13% were accomplished, 31% proficient, and then the rest sort of below that proficient line, right? So this is from the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So if I've actually pulled the right data from that report, because it's a 260-page report, about 46% of people are proficient thinkers. So it's important to note that these were college students, right? In fact, the actual report from the OECD is called "Does Higher Education Teach Students to Think Critically?" Again, like a 260-page report, which, if you're interested in this, you could go read. I did not, in all transparency, read all 260 pages because I was just trying to get a foundation. Again, that foundational type of research. Okay, so the problem, again, as I was trying to sort of unpack why critical thinking is important, right? Everyone thinks, this is according to criticalthinking.org, right? It's in our nature to do so, but much of our thinking left to itself is biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, or downright prejudiced. Yet the quality of our life and that of what we produce, make, or build depends precisely on the quality of our thought. Shoddy thinking is costly both in money and in quality of life. Excellence in thought, however, must be systematically cultivated. So we have to develop it. This is something that Professor Herrick talked about in the guest lecture, is that we all have the ability to think, but we are biased. We fall into sometimes these sort of performative debates. And that's not new. It's maybe exacerbated by social media and things like that. So again, this kind of dovetails with some things that Professor Herrick was talking about, but where this sort of concept of critical thinking comes from. And he showed us Socrates the other day, right? And I won't go into depth on this. Socrates, 2,500 years ago, sort of discovered a method. I mean, and it's hard to say, did other people have this? Did they know about it? Were they practicing these things? I don't think that it's to say that critical thinking just didn't exist before Socrates. I think we all, expect that there was some form of critical thinking, but he put his own stamp on it, right? And among the other things that Socrates was really focused on is precise definitions of things. How much evidence do we have? Are things self-contradictory? So really kind of looking at that rationalization that Professor Herrick talked about, right? And who has the authority and why do they have authority? As we go through the research track and we think about your projects, I think it's very important to create a foundation for terminology. What do we mean by something? Within a large field, there might be slightly different definitions of a term. You can do a Google search for definitions of critical thinking, and you'll probably find quite a few. And different people are going to define it differently. And so, again, some of the sciences, there are kind of agreed upon definitions, right? But when we're writing something, we always want to kind of stake that claim, right? Here's what I mean by this particular term. Now, there are others, of course. This is Thomas Aquinas, right? Again, part of this systematic critical thinking embedded in the writings and teaching of thinkers, right? I'm going to jump down to the second paragraph here. Aquinas heightened our awareness not only of the potential power of reasoning, but also the need of reasoning to be systematically, again, cultivated and cross-examined, right? Are we sure? How do we know? Why do we think what we think, right? Of course, Aquinas' thinking also illustrates that those who think critically do not always reject established beliefs, only those beliefs that lack reasonable foundation. So again, testing things, really thinking about them, investigating them. What is the reason behind these? And we'll talk about this more as we get into sort of research questions. Now, if you dive into sort of the history of critical thinking, you'll probably also come across this person. This is John Dewey. And he's sort of credited with introducing the actual term that we now use, critical thinking. Professor Herrick had an interesting explanation of where the term came from, so it'd be interesting to unpack that too. It's likely that John Dewey was pulling from Socrates and things like that. So I don't know the exact lineage, but I would encourage you to investigate it, right? Dewey called this like sort of reflective thought, reflective thinking. And I think that's important. An important part of critical thinking is that we engage in that sort of metacognitive part, where we think about how information has changed our thoughts or ideas on a particular topic, right? So again, this idea of really engaging, right? And moving away from sort of a passive acceptance or passive reading of something to real critical thinking and actively participating in that research. Okay, moving on. Critical or reflective thinking originates with the sensing of a problem. So we have to think of a problem first. What is the issue? It is a quality of thought operating in an effort to solve the problem and to reach a tentative conclusion which is supported by all available data. I think that's important, and we'll talk about this, especially I'll talk about Richard Feynman, quantum physicist. But what is the data that we have? And that data might change tomorrow. So we're going to come to the best possible good faith conclusion that we can, given the information that we have up to the time that we're working, right? And all we're doing is trying to advance that conversation. If we can solve it, great. But again, the goal isn't necessarily to solve something maybe even within our lifetime, but to move things forward so that other people can continue that work. Okay, is really a process of problem solving requiring the use of creative insight, intellectual honesty, and sound judgment, and that is the basis of the method of scientific inquiry. The success of democracy depends to a large extent on the disposition and ability of citizens to think critically and reflectively about the problems which must of necessity confront them, and to improve the quality of their thinking is one of the major goals of education. Absolutely agree. I love that last part. It's a little bit wordy, so the wording, not so much as a writer, but I think that end goal of education, right, to improve the quality of thinking, not what to think, but how to think. And again, this is actually from a quote from Commission of the Relation of School and College of the Progressive Education Association in 1943 via the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, so real quickly, how does it work, right? Again, there are a number of different ways that we could think about it, but clarify your thinking, purpose, and context, question your sources, identify the arguments, both your own and those on different sides of a particular topic, analyze the sources and the arguments, and I'll give you some tools for this as we progress forward, evaluate the arguments of others, and create or synthesize your own arguments. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of research as creative, but it absolutely is. And that is where we start to move forward and experience what Thomas Kuhn calls paradigm shifts, which, again, I'll come back to in later classes. So, benefits of critical thinking, right? And you all probably know this, so I'm probably preaching to the choir, right? Enhanced decision-making, effective problem solving, reduction of cognitive biases, and enhanced communication skills. In order to sort of cultivate these, right? Because again, my mind goes to, great, this is an important skill. How do I improve it, right? So we can be curious and inquisitive, so ask questions, think little kid questions, think silly questions, develop our analytical skills by engaging in those discussions, as Professor Herrick talked about, evaluating information, practicing reflection. What do I think? Why do I think it? What's my evidence? Embracing intellectual humility, knowing when to say you don't know is an asset, right? Overconfidence leads to a lot of possible issues. So we can talk about that more. Develop your sense of belonging within an academic community, and then align your view and your values. Okay, I'm trying to cruise through these because I do need to get to a class, so my timing was bad here. I was going to talk briefly about commonplace books. I will talk about this more in class, so I'm just going to leave this little tidbit here, that a commonplace book used to be a notebook where people copied out parts of books, quotes, little bits of information, and kept it kind of in a notebook for future reference. A lot of us maybe use our phone or something to keep track of notes, but I'm going to make an argument in the coming weeks that you begin to keep a sort of commonplace book for your research, in addition to a research log, or using a online tool like Zotero or ResearchRabbit or something like that. So, all right, there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later.